1. Just to clarify, I am a female in my early 20s now. This happened when I was about 12 years old. I was in year 8, I'm guessing that is the same as 8th grade in America. Anyway, I was on my way home from school with my friend Kira. Kira was really small and had very childlike features. She was also extremely timid and easily scared. We decided to take a quick detour to the local supermarket for a drink and some snacks. Although this was frightening at the time, I'm glad I made that detour, and you will understand why very soon. We got into the shop and went straight to the sweets aisle. It was fairly empty. There was only me, Kira, and a young Muslim girl stood staring at all the variety of sweets. She was smaller than Kira, and like I said, Kira was small. If I had to put an age on this girl, I would say she was about 7 or 8. I couldn't see her parents, but just assumed they had told her to choose some sweets and then return to them. I'm a very observant person, naturally, and will instinctively react if I see someone in danger or figure out what to do if I notice anything suspicious. As we were browsing for sweets, I noticed in the corner of my eye, a man stood at the bottom of the aisle, staring. I ignored it for a moment, thinking he was checking what aisle he needed. But he stayed. He didn't move. I shot a glance over to him and tried to work out why he was stood there. The man was also clearly Muslim. I would say around the age of 30. For a second, I figured he must be her father. But something didn't seem right. He was staring blankly at her. I turned to the little girl and then back to the man. I did this several times, and with no doubt in my mind, I knew he was watching her. If he was with her, surely he would have walked over to her or called her name. He was not her father, her uncle, her brother. I looked towards him again for a moment, and I could tell his eyes were so fixated on her that he hadn't noticed me staring at him. I looked away as not to stare too long, but it was bothering me. I could still see him in the corner of my eye. I need to intervene, I thought silently. Kira had been talking continuously at this point, but somewhere in the conversation I had switched off. She tugged my arm, and I turned to her. Something had to be done. This girl's parents were nowhere in sight, and I knew I was the only person who could potentially stop whatever sick ideas this man had for this girl. I looked back at the sweets, but kept the girl in the corner of my eye as I told Kira to be quiet, and I explained what was going on. "Shit," she whispered. "What do we do?" I had been thinking while she panicked. Brave but very naive 12-year-old me decided we go stand with the girl. We are going to walk over to her. As we stand next to her, you keep your eyes on the man. Do not take them off of him, Kira. I am going to ask where her parents are. With that said, we walked towards the girl, one of us at either side of her. My heart was racing for fear of what his intentions were. I tend to get very angry when I'm afraid, and my fear was solely for this girl. I knelt down beside her and said, "Hello, where are your parents?" She looked at me puzzled. I realized now that we looked like the creeps, not him. "I'm not sure. They told me to grab what I wanted and then go find them." I looked at her face, so sweet, so innocent. I replied, "Would it be okay if we helped you find your parents?" I didn't want her to go find them alone in case the man got to her before they did. "Yes, please," she replied. Kira never took her eyes off of the creep the entire time I was speaking to the little girl. She said he looked angry and sort of confused at what was going on, and he walked away just before we took her to find her parents. I took her hand and hurried her along as we searched a few aisles for her mother and father. It didn't take long until we found them. I was relieved as she ran over to them and placed her sweets in the trolley. "Thank you," she said. Her parents looked at us with concern, so I approached them quickly to explain why she just thanked us. I told them that a man had been watching their daughter intensely for the past 5 minutes, and I was worried I couldn't see her parents. They thanked me many times before I left the shop. I remember how terrified the mother looked as I told her. She took my hand and thanked me again before we left. It's over, I thought. The little girl is safe, and I am so glad I took a detour. Me and Kira left the shop, and Kira decided she didn't want to go home yet, so insisted I come to her friend's house with her. Not today. I really need to get home, otherwise my dad will start to worry. She nodded and set off in the opposite direction. I began walking home alone. It felt strange. Something in my gut was telling me to turn around. I walked through the car park and past the usual shops. And then I turned. He was behind me, merely yards away. As soon as I caught his eyes, I turned around and picked up pace. My heart was pounding. I was only 12. I knew I couldn't outrun a grown man, and I was way too small to fight him. Think, I screamed in my head. I kept passing shop after shop. No one was around. It was roughly an hour after school ended by this point, and all of the school kids had been to the local shops and gone home, usually in large groups. The sweet shop, I thought to myself. At the top of this path I was on, inside the car park supermarket complex, was a small sweet shop. Nearly all of the kids from school flocked there after school ended for their cheap sweets. I knew there was a security guard inside. He was always there. He watched out for the kids stealing sweets. If I can get to the shop before it closes, I'll be safe, I thought. Yes, it closed early on school days as the customers were us kids. I was hoping for dear life the shutters weren't down. I knew if it was closed, I didn't stand a chance. My route home was simple, but not so much if you're being chased. After I passed that shop, I had to turn right under a bridge, then climb large stone stairs to walk over the bridge, to then walk up a large hill to get home. I didn't stand a chance. Not to mention I had severe asthma that was made worse when I was panicked or nervous. I picked up as much pace as possible without running. I didn't want him to think I was aware that I was being followed. He was walking at a steady pace, but keeping his eyes glued to me. Suddenly, as I was about to reach the shop, I saw the security guard. He stepped out of the shop just as I reached it. I scurried over to him and told him everything that was going on. I told him what happened in the supermarket, and then that he was following me. I felt my heart pounding as the man slowly creeped closer. I have about half a mile to walk. Please. He cut me off. He looked angry. Go, now. Don't stop walking. I'll stop him and keep him here as long as I can. Don't look back. Just move as fast as you can. I ran around the corner and then heard the security guard say, Stop. I then speed-walked as fast as my legs could carry me over the bridge. His voice faded as I walked further. I knew he wouldn't let him hurt me. I felt okay. That feeling in my stomach had gone. I was okay. I reached home with no problem. I never told my grandparents, but, like I say, I've always been cautious, and even if I put myself at risk, I'm glad I was able to help that little girl. 2. I'm from backwoods county, Utah. The entire area was awash with original urban legends, theories on Skinwalker Ranch, and government conspiracies. It was easy to find a few bored teenagers interested in taking a trip out to Blue Baby Bridge, or go hunting on the hillside glute. It was less easy to find someone interested in investigating something government-related, considering an incident with Skinwalker Ranch, and how close-knit and informed about one another the community was. Things government-related were just untouched, even if ears perked up at the mention of anything fishy in the area. Freshly 18 and with a car of my own, I was wholly into everything that was unusual in Utah. At that point, I had moved to Colorado, which in my opinion was far less interesting in terms of tales and happenings. I had a week off from work, and decided to take a trip to Utah to visit old friends. Many had moved away, but 2 remained, and it being a small town, they were easy to locate. Both were just as bored as I was, and both were nice enough to split gas money if we all agreed on a trip out into some random part, further east from where we were. It was a pretty common thing for teenagers to do in the area. There were a lot of hidden camping spots and cool hieroglyphics further up in the canyons, and even some simple cave systems. The most interesting things tended to happen at night. Bored as we were, we couldn't care less about seeing something unusual. We craved it. Craved meeting up with one of the urban legends, craved seeing a skinwalker, craved stumbling upon something we shouldn't, because we hadn't experienced the unusual. Most of people's adventures ended in disappointment or fake and easily debunked tales. As the sun descended over the horizon, we drove north from the town. Ophelia, sitting in the passenger seat next to me, seemed to have an exact idea of where she wanted to go. She pointed me down a few roads, through a couple of significantly smaller towns, and finally, east along a road that led to Bonanza. Initially, I was confused. Why Bonanza? No one cares about Bonanza. Nothing happens there. It's dust and mines and caved-in dead ends. She ignored me for a large portion of the journey, only giving me directions periodically and blowing off all my inquiries. Boris sat silently in the back. When we grew a few miles closer to the town, Ophelia had me pull over, and at that point, her unusual behavior had my palms sweating. Boris leaned over the console between us, saying how he didn't think this was a good idea, and how we could be, potentially, in over our heads, how the rumor sounded implausible and stupid. I was irritated at that point. Boris knew what she was doing, but I didn't. I felt more like the clueless driver than anything. I finally turned to Ophelia for an explanation as she was digging in her backpack and passing Boris and I flashlights. If it's true, it could be something really cool, she had said, popping open her door and stepping out into the dusty night air. Her refusal to fill me in was unusual, but the fact she dragged us into another set of antics wasn't. So, with a less than amused sigh, I shared a look with Boris and exited the car. To our left were tall silhouettes of deserted hills. In front of us, winding dirt roads, miles from civilization. Ophelia shined her light up into the hills and crossed the road. Boris and I followed in tow, shining our lights around the sage bushes and up along the hill, just as she was. "What are we looking for?" I remember asking, and was again ignored. She seemed more focused on the telephone poles and following the connected wires. "Do what I'm doing. Look where each is leading. It's along the road somewhere." I pressed her with more questions, but did as she said, and the three of us ended up a long ways apart. I remember heading further south down the road, so far from Ophelia and Boris that I could hardly make out their lights. My eyes followed the light up the telephone pole and along the barely visible black wires. I expected them to trail to another pole, like the last several I had investigated. The wires disappeared into the hillside. I squinted hard to see where they connected, and failed to see any kind of structure the wires could be feeding into, aside from small rocks and dirt. I jogged back down the road and called out loudly to Ophelia and Boris, telling them I found something unusual in the lines. Ophelia seemed ecstatic, and raced ahead of me until I had to slow her down and point to the pole. Her jaw hung open for a good several moments before she was speeding towards the hill and trying to scramble up the loose dirt. I was fed up with the information she was withholding, and I told her I was going back to the car if she didn't tell me what she was looking for. She shushed me, started pressing on further up the hill, rambling breathlessly. Something along the lines of an old man she had spoken to, who believed there was a military base or something hidden beneath the Bonanza Hills, where the telephone lines disappeared into the thicker hills, north of the community along 45. By what she described, He was a paranoid wreck. The entire thing had me more and more anxious. It was pitch dark aside from our lights. I had chills down my spine, and every noise had me jerking my light to see if anyone was there. It could be serious shit. It could be nothing. I didn't want to end up abducted into a facility or filed as a missing persons case. Boris seemed to share my sentiment. He cupped his hands around his mouth, repeatedly calling for Ophelia to get away from the lines. Not only was it dangerous, but unwanted attention could be called to us. I must have jinxed us with the thought, because further up the hill multiple lights, in far better condition than our own, touched over the hills and landed on Boris and I. I was too blinded to see who it was, and too spooked to stand there and wait for them. I remember panicking, flicking my light towards the hill to see Ophelia skittering down the face of the hill, kicking up rocks and dust and taking off down the road like the track runner she was. The individuals, men, shouted obscenities at us and demanded that we stop and put our hands up. I didn't give a second thought to sprinting after Ophelia, clicking off my flashlight and relying on the light of the moon. I heard Boris's hard footsteps and ragged breathing behind me, and several shots from firearms. I ran faster than I ever had in my life. When we reached the car, we scrambled in, and the doors weren't even shut before I had shakily jammed my keys into the ignition, turned around, and sped down 45 as fast as I could. Several times I thought I was going to end up in a ditch or off the road. Ophelia insisted I keep my headlights off for a mile or so. I didn't see the point. There was one road, and they knew where we were going. No headlights came behind us, however. The drive felt like ours, and it was only when I hit close to the 3240 that I began to feel remotely safe. On Highway 40, I didn't let up on the gas in the slightest. Days later, a couple of men, obviously not local, were reported to have been roaming around the town asking questions about 45. If anyone had recently taken a trip down there, if anyone had come back from Bonanza. No one knew about our venture. We had said we were going camping and nothing more, and had the minimal gear to prove it. I continue to think about it to this day, and is one of the reasons I keep my ears tuned for things similar. I haven't been back to Utah for years. 3. Please be aware the following story contains themes of extreme animal abuse. 3. I was 19 when all of this mess was brought into my life, and I've never really talked about it with anyone. I'm an animal lover, and this really took a toll on my mental state. I was living with my grandmother, who claims all this to be my fault. First off, you need to know my grandmother can be a nightmare. She's made way more enemies than friends. She's hard to be around and is one of those people who calls the cops on her neighbors if they play music outside. So it was no surprise to me when she decided to move out of the city and relocate to a rural area after my grandfather passed away. She moved to this town where they have a grand population of maybe 500, and she lived on the very outskirts of town. She had neighbors. She just had dense forest between the houses. I moved in with her, in fear of her living on her own. After making some arrangements, getting a job, transferring to a college that would be closer, etc., I relocated to help her in any way I could. But with no surprise, by the time I got up there and settled, she complained to me she was already having issues with the man who lived next to her. I just had no idea how huge these problems really were. My grandmother decided to try her hand at dog breeding and raising chickens. Her focus was on small breed dogs and laying hens. I told her the chickens were a good idea, but I didn't believe in backyard breeding. But it was her house and her land, so she did what she very damn well pleased. Things started off bad. Her neighbor that she was having issues with came to the property line every day and watched me do everything from feeding the animals to just yard work. He always had a beer with him, and he was totally creepy. He was older, around 54-ish, with greyed hair and a smile that instantly made you uncomfortable. It scared me out of my mind, and I contacted the police multiple times. But alas, the police said they could do nothing since he was on his property, and said nothing to me. Ever. After the first month of him creeping is when my grandmother decided to take things into her own hands, and naturally made things worse. This guy started bringing a freaking machete with him to watch me. And I even woke up to him on our porch swing one morning. He just said nothing, got up, and went on his way. After time passes from my grandmother basically declaring war with this man, he escalated to throwing trash in the yard daily. He built a barbed wire fence on the property line. There was no need, his property line is thick forest. And then the icing on the cake. My grandmother's chickens started coming up dead, necks broken, and just left there. The police couldn't do anything because being creepy isn't evidence. I tried to stay up and catch him, but with all my chores, school, and work, I think he watched me enough to know my days off, and did it when I couldn't afford to watch late into the night. After dealing with that for a while, we started locking the coop. The problem seemed to have been solved. The first litters my grandmother had were huge for small dogs, 4 to 5 puppies in each litter, and she had 4 litters. She had them in side-by-side kennels on the carport, lifted off the ground. There was way too many to have inside. All the animal care was my responsibility. I was in school to become a vet. So I stayed on top of the puppies, since she had to put them outside. They were about 3 weeks old when someone started coming at night, or during the day when we weren't at home, and taking them, just one at a time. Police reports were made, just nothing ever done. I thought it was weird, and hoped at least whoever took them was bottle feeding them, and planned on selling them. I was so wrong. They took 5 puppies in a time frame of 2 weeks. In 5 days, the puppies started being brought back. One a day, decapitated, and blood drained. But they didn't bring the whole puppy back. They either brought back the heads or the bodies, never both. They knew exactly which puppy belonged to what litter, and put the puppy parts in with the rest of the puppies for me to find when I examined them daily. I was mortified. Surprisingly, it was my fault according to my grandmother. Apparently, I teased the neighbor by going outside every day and gave him a show. Someone had to feed the animals and do the yard work. After all the puppies were returned, the next week, I woke to dogs dead in the yard, beaten and stabbed to death with a pitchfork. After the 3rd dog, I couldn't take any more. I packed whatever I could fit in my car and moved to my dad's an hour away that day. As I was leaving, with tears in my eyes and my grandmother screaming the word whore at me, there he was, in his usual spot on the property line, smiling at me. His smile sent chills down my spine, and I instantly felt rage. I flipped him off and screamed, "Fuck you," out of the window as I passed. And his reaction was to blow me a kiss. There's still a lot of tension with my grandmother all these years later. I still go to check on her and visit, but I don't ask about the animals, and I never stay long enough for him to realize I'm there. I haven't seen her neighbor since, and I don't look or ask for him. So, creepy neighbor man I only knew as Russell, please let's never meet again. Hey everyone, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 106. I hope that last story wasn't too extreme for some of you. It was quite shocking to read, and well, I almost didn't put it in there, but well, when all's said and done, there are very bad people in the world, and we should all beware of those bad people, I think. That being said, there are also some very good people in the world, so I'm always on the lookout for positive stories. I'd like to maybe in the future do a video with positive stories in it, and that's something I'll kind of need to get my finger out and get a look for. Sadly, it's the negative things that tend to get more attention. And well, I have looked in the past for, the kind of stories of people doing exceptionally good things. Well, they're harder to come by. But I'm convinced they're out there, so I'll keep looking, and I'm sure I'll strike gold, so to speak, somewhere down the line. Okay, so with those words, I'm gonna say goodbye just now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.